4-week series that we've entitled Coming Together, Coming Apart, Candid Conversations about Israel, about Jewish values and the future of Judaism. I'm Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sheremet, and I'm here along with Maharat Rory Picker-Nice from the JCRC and Rabbi Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation and Rabbi Carney Rose from B'nai Emunah Congregation. And we, as many of you know, if not all of you, that we've been gathering for now 4 weeks on Tuesday afternoon to study together, to engage in a lot of schmoozing and dialogue and interaction with those of you who are out there in virtual Jewish communal world, listening and putting your questions into the chat box and challenging us to address the issues. Just to review for all of you who have been with us and those who have not been able to, we've over the last 3 weeks addressed a number of different issues of Jewish identity and Jewish values, Israel and Palestine, the American Jewish community and our relationship with the Israeli Jewish community and the rest of the world. We began by looking at some of the Hartman Institute from Jerusalem content and ideas that have been presented through the study that each of us has done as senior rabbinic fellows at the Hartman Institute, talking about Auschwitz versus Sinai, the frame with which we look at Jewish communal life. Do we look at our Jewish values and our Jewish identities through the lens of Auschwitz, the post-Holocaust lens, or through the lens of Sinai, the vision of mitzvah and blessing for all time through the lens of the Jewish people's values in Torah and beyond? We studied in depth the question of universalism versus particularism. How do we feel about being Jews and concern for the Jewish people specifically versus our obligation for all people and for the world as a whole? Last week we dove deeply into the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and how they overlap and intersect. And today we're going to wrap up with first a discussion of identity politics and how it impacts us as a Jewish community. And then at the end we're going to try and leave plenty of time for you not merely to hear us talk, but for you to have an opportunity to ask us questions that may be remaining and push us to respond to ideas about what you have on your mind. And then we'll conclude, hopefully all of that before 2:30 again today. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here together. And I'd like to begin today with this question of identity politics. What does it mean when we hear the word identity politics, and how does this both social construct and academic construct impact us as a Jewish community? So I'm going to ask Rabbi Bogard, who's our Zoom angel here with us today, as one of the panelists, but also helping us with technology, to share his screen so that we can look together at a definition of identity politics and speak about what these words mean. We've all heard this word. It's in the news all the time, and it's part of our agenda, in a sense, as Jews. But a particular definition for identity politics can be found here on your screen. It is a tendency for people of a particular religion, race, social background, or other constructs to form exclusive political alliances, to move away from traditional broad-based party politics. Or, as you can see if we read down just a little bit further, 2 other ways of framing this concept. Identity politics describes a political approach wherein a people of a particular religion, race, social background, class, or some other identifying factor begin to form exclusive socio-political alliances, and we move away from our broad-based coalition and coalitional politics to support and follow political movements that share a particular identifying quality with them. Its aim is to support and center the concerns, agendas, and projects of a particular group in accordance with specific social and political changes that we might wish to see. In other words, identity politics is how we allow our values to intersect with the group or groups with whom we identify. And I'd like to bring back our panel now and really spend some time talking about how we personally respond to this idea of our identity. I'm going to ask each of you to join with me in sharing sort of how you summarize your identity. How do you see yourself? What is your primary identity or identities? And how do you find yourself as a rabbi, as a member of the Jewish community, struggling with how to define yourself? I don't want to say too much, so I'm going to just turn it to whoever would like to jump in. If one of you wants to, don't be shy. I know we all are.
I'm happy
Otherwise, I'm
to
going to.
to start off. Sorry. Do you have?
No, go ahead. I was going to have to call on you, Rory, so go
No,
ahead.
it's fine. I always find this question really interesting for me because I feel like I'm often in situations um, where I am asked to speak specifically to a particular identity. So, being a woman in the Orthodox community, being ordained woman in the Orthodox community, oftentimes it's very much in the context of feminism, doing interfaith work. Very much it's in the context of my Judaism, and so I certainly I find those identities change in various moments, or what is sometimes taking the primary. So your question of what's at the forefront is interesting, but for me also really changing. And I also want to name that I'm really aware of the fact that at the end of the day, I'm the sum total of all of those identities. So even as I'm speaking from a feminist lens, I'm speaking from a feminist lens as Jew and as an Orthodox woman and as an American, and all of those. And so I think a lot of what I'm naming are probably the primary identities that tend to come to the forefront. I think that what often drives me is very much being a mother, and that's something that I think about even more so in the context that we're in right now. Like I said, being Jewish, being Orthodox, being female, being a professional in the Jewish community. Um, those would probably be the primary driving forces for me.
Thanks. Carney or Daniel, do you want to jump in and respond?
So I've been thinking a lot this week since you sent out the prompts, Jim, about notions of identity, and this is going to be maybe a little less personal, but the piece I keep coming back to is the way in which identity doesn't just exist within us and doesn't just exist outside of us in society, but actually I think exists at the meeting place between the two. Right, and it strikes me that the way that so many Ashkenazi Jews talk about their whiteness uh, relates to this. In particular, this sort of idea that I grew up with this. Look, I remember sitting there filling out the whatever it was, the pre-SAT, and one of the questions is they ask you your ethnicity, and like I wasn't gonna write Caucasian because Caucasian wasn't how I ever thought of myself, right? Uh, and it certainly would have been absurd to my great grandparents to imagine that, right, like I would be identified with people who came from the Caucasus. Uh, right, being a Jew wasn't a choice in Europe, I think, any more than being a person of color is a choice in the United States, at least historically. Though Europe, as we saw last week with Carney's videos, is not a necessarily safe place for Jews of any racial or ethnic makeup. Um, but what has really struck me these last, I don't know how many years, and sort of as I have become much more aware of the privileges that my perceived whiteness gives me in society, is that, right, to a really profound extent, it doesn't matter whether or not I perceive myself as white because I go through the world benefiting from the whiteness that other people apply to me when they see me, right? Like I go like this and I'm just another white dude in the street. Dude being another key word here in terms of identity and privilege. So yeah, I guess that's where my head is at. The ways that no matter how much we want to assert our identity into the public square is also asserting an identity back onto us, and our actual identities, I think, are always being negotiated within relationship.
That's really important and powerful. Carney, you want to jump in and add your perspective as well?
Sure. I want to drop in by starting. I'm actually hearing reverberations. Sorry. Thank you. I want to start by saying that I grew up in Canada. And the notion of multiculturalism in Canada, I think, influenced me in a way that maybe others in the United States are not influenced. Meaning, I never felt like we had to have unhyphenated realities in our lives. Our identities were always hyphenated. And yes, better. And those hyphenated identities have always worked for me. But I would say that if I have to essentialize, which I know is always dangerous, but I will anyway, to say that for me, my identity first and foremost is Jewish. That doesn't mean that I don't care about the things that are happening out there in the world at large, but rather I care about them because I come from a particularist orientation. Now, maybe back to the conversation we had about universalism versus particularism, but I think it very much for me resonates with the notion that I see myself first and foremost as identified as a member of the House of Israel, and everything else that I do is based on that. And whatever happens out there in the world, I refract through that reality. Now, I'm sure we're going to get into the conversation. That does not mean that I am a one issue voter, because I don't think that Judaism has one answer to all of the great challenges that we're going to be discussing today, and we're going to continue to address as a community going forward, particularly now as we're going through the beginning of the process of the times for election. It cannot be, at least for me, and I don't think it would be disingenuous of me as a Jew to be a one issue voter, because our tradition is a panoply, a mosaic. That was a term that we grew up in Canada using all the time. Cultural mosaic, that kind of notion, and that's, I think, for me, the way I would identify myself. I am a collage, right? I am a mosaic, but the centerpiece, or that which your eye goes to immediately, is what I would call Jewish.
Thanks. That's beautiful. It reminded me of one of the great ironies of the English language. I remember the first time I heard reference to the Mosaic Law, meaning the law of Moses, the Torah. Um, I thought it fascinating that it is also, as you described, Carney, so beautifully, a mosaic. It's not a monolithic set of values or laws, but in fact our tradition is mosaic, and it's not only from Moses, but it is constructed in that way. So thank you for bringing that to the light. We will come back for sure to this question of one-issue voters and the election season that we're entering. I'm not even sure we're entering it. I'm not sure we ever left the last one, but that's a discussion for another time. But I want to just add my own voice here briefly. I've thought about this question of identity politics without realizing it ever since I was an adolescent. I remember being asked one time in religious school by my rabbi or teacher, "Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American?" And I was always confused by that question because, frankly, because of my upbringing, which was a very strong, mainstream, liberal, reform Jewish identity, I always thought of myself as an American first and then a Jew. And I remember these fascinating arguments and debates that we would have. This is back in the 1960s and 70s, about if, God forbid, there should be a conflict between the United States and Israel, which side would you fight on? And for me, I always struggled. And as you said, Carney, this goes back to that question we grappled with 2 weeks ago about universalism versus particularism. My own instinctive draw is first to the draw of universalism, but also to the draw of peoplehood. And when we identify with more than one people, in this case American and Jew, it becomes the source of great conflict. And I think this identity politics question really becomes real for us all, not because of when it's easy. It's easy when I can say, yeah, I'm an American Jew or I'm a Jewish American, and they intersect beautifully. It's when that intersectionality becomes conflictual, when the conflicts happen. So I'd like to ask us to talk a little bit, as specifically as we can, about, for us as rabbis and as outspoken members of the Jewish community, what are those moments of conflict that we personally have experienced or know about that are most profound for us? In other words, how does identity politics not affect the Jews? You know, the question of this topic was, is it good for the Jews? But I want to ask, when does it affect these Jews, us, those of us here? Like, how have we interact? How has this been hard for us as Jews? I'll throw it back to any of you who want to dive in there and tackle that. Or maybe it hasn't been difficult for you. I suspect it has.
So I'm sure it's been difficult for everybody. I want to just throw out one other piece for me. Growing up in Canada, this notion of national pride was more around hockey than honest to God, it was more around hockey than it was around politics or the military. And it was for me an amazing shift in consciousness. There were two things that I remember when I moved to the United States that kind of freaked. And first of all, I'm an American by birth. So I was born in New York, but we moved to Canada. I was very young. Two things. First of all, I never thought I would hear of a Jewish Republican, right? Other than Jacob Javits. That was sort of it. I thought, and we learned to, we learned about American politics, about American history, but we just sort of assumed that every Jew was a Democrat. And that was kind of a moment for me. By the way, in the first congregation that I served, there was a very strong Republican reality within the congregation. And I remember once speaking about Pesach, and I said, we lean to the left because all Jews lean to the left. Right. And I remember being summoned to the office of this very prominent philanthropist in the Jewish community who wanted to remind me, of course, that not all Jews lean to the left. So I think that one of the elements here for me is that there is a different reality about patriotism in America that I think we are all facing. And that when one challenges often the status quo, one is immediately labeled as unpatriotic. And that how significant and important it is for American Jewish identity, that patriotism is to American Jewish identity. And we want to be part of that bandwagon of support for these United States, which, by the way, is very beautiful for me. And I've come over the years, I think I sort of initially snickered every time we sang God Bless America in shul, but over the course of time, it actually brings tears to my eyes. And I've learned to appreciate how powerful it is to be part of a system with that kind of sense of patriotism and nationalism. Now, it has many edges and many moments and I'm sure the others are going to share those moments. But I wanted to start there for me because I sort of feel this great privilege of having lived in places where it was not consequential. And I think to the detriment of the communities in which I found myself in Canada. Whereas living in a place like the United States, or in Israel for that matter, that sense of patriotism and nationalism have brought a significant amount of pride. So I want us to make sure, at least for me, to honor that part of this conversation. As difficult as the moments are, I always sort of say, thank God I am a Jew. Thank God I'm an American. Thank God I live in a time and a place where we can have this discussion and we can feel these tensions of what we're laying out right now as a binary. But of course, in the final analysis, we're going to, I hope, agree that it isn't a binary reality.
Beautiful, beautifully put. Daniel and Rory?
Jim, first, I like vividly remember doing the "Which army would you fight for" activity actually at Camp Ramota. And I remember, I can remember where I was standing in my house when I was sort of arguing with my mother when she said America and I said Israel. So yeah, right. I keep Rory, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had a clear answer on all of this. That's, I think, part of the challenge with all of it. I mean, I also, similar to you, Daniel, I remember, those conversations. If America ever went to war with Israel, which side would you be on? And we could ask that sort of laughingly because we could never imagine that those would ever be in conflict, right? There was, it was sort of like a joke in some ways because we never really had to make that choice. And I think also for me, growing up in New York in such a Jewish neighborhood, even that question. And I remember also not totally understanding like the Jewish American versus American Jew, like what is that, kind of what does the grammatical structure even mean? But I grew up in a community where how you voted in American politics could very much be your Jewish communal interests because the Jewish community was our entire, I mean, not really the entire, but so much of our city council district or maybe even our state legislative district. And so there were certain places where it was always not just a Jew, but an Orthodox Jew that was elected into those roles where we would see those really intertwined. And so it's interesting to me, both the ways in which our identities have been able to merge, or we've been able to merge identities, and I think also ways in which I reflect on the ways in which we sometimes ignore the conflicts, right? I think I've been having some conversations recently, and I don't want to bring up another controversy within all of this, but I think all of you will get the reference of, the debates that have taken place around the statue of St. Louis and the name of St. Louis. And we're in conversation with the Archdiocese about putting together, like, sneak peek, you'll get more information, but a program to kind of talk about this shared history or the ways in which our stories diverge. But I got a call from a reporter recently about it, and as he's asking me, and he says, sort of like, when did you know that St. Louis was problematic in the Jewish community? And I was like, I don't know, it was just like a thing we knew, like we just kind of knew it. And he said, like, did someone tell you? And I was like, I don't know, it was like a joke at like a Shabbos meal. Someone would be like, oh well, St. Louis, not good for the Jews. And he said, how did it make you feel? And I said, I don't know, there's lots of things in the world that aren't good for the Jews. It wasn't like, it never was like I can't believe I live in a city that's named for a Catholic saint. It's like being Jewish is the names of the things are sometimes not Jewish, and so it's also, I'm sort of skirting around your question in some ways, Jim, because I don't know that I have a good answer, but I'm just like aware of the ways in which also we have sort of subconsciously reconciled our different identities, because there's parts in which it's just kind of like, yeah, like the TV shows are all going to have Christmas specials, and I'm not going to get up in arms because that's just what always happens, and we all just kind of know it, and that's not like antithetical to my Jewish identity, right? Like being Jewish in America is like Jews wrote most of the Christmas carols or whatever, right? So I think that's also like we have to kind of name the fact that I think we've subsumed a lot of those parts of our identity because we've sort of been trained to know which parts of our identity are minority, right? Or like as a woman, which things are going to be in male-centric language, or which things are going to be in white-centric language, or which things are going to be Christian-centric language. And I think we've sort of learned in our minds how to translate it. And it's only when it's really pointed out that we can pause and say, oh yeah, that actually isn't inclusive. But you've sort of learned that when someone says like, hey guys, like, I don't stop to say there's women here. That's kind of the gender neutral plural.
Yeah, thank you. It makes me think about whether we actually put our identity first or our values first. In other words, back to that question about this imaginary, please God, conflict between this nation and Israel. The way I always framed this myself was, are we being asked to commit to an identity at all cost, or regardless of what that identity says or does, or are we being asked to evaluate based on kind of a situational ethical response? In other words, I would fight for the nation at that moment in that theoretical conflict with whose values I felt aligned at that moment. I don't think I would cast blind loyalty to either my people or to my nation of residence or of citizenship simply because of that identity, that my identity takes second place to my values. And I think that actually leads us into the next question I kind of want to pose for us to talk about a little. And I'd actually like us to just try and catalog a little bit the specific issues that are causing this question of identity politics to be so unsettling and so disturbing and so potentially conflictual for us as American Jews today. We've already talked a little bit about political loyalties, and we each know as rabbis and as leaders of the community how easy it is for us to be labeled or aligned as being pro one political position or another. If I don't agree with you, you're being too political, Rabbi. You're being too supportive of a position that I don't agree with. But I'm curious to know if we can just kind of state the obvious and discuss briefly for all those who are joining us today, how we perceive to be the conflict of Jewish identity politics. We know it exists, but where does it exist? So, Carney, go ahead.
So
Or
can I
Danny,
push back a little bit, Jim?
Yeah, please.
And that is, I'm thoroughly convinced by much of the social science research that has come out, particularly since the 2016 election, looking at the power of partisan tribal identity and basically showing us that the reasons that we have, or the reasons that we say we have for our political positions, are almost always secondary after the fact justifications that explain something about our pre-existing tribal identities, right? It's how you can know in an American context with an incredibly high, yeah, someone just said, "In my values come from my identity." Exactly. Someone in the chat. A reminder, by the way, type in your questions in the chat. But right, it's how you can know that if you meet someone in the United States who is right, describes themselves in their own terms as like deeply pro-Israel, and they're very much in favor of the settlements and the continued, they probably wouldn't use the occupation, they'd probably talk about Judea and Samaria, right? It's how you can know that that same person in American political context almost certainly also doesn't believe in global warming and is a lot less likely to wear a mask, right? Like these things make no sense together as political opinions, but they make a lot of sense together when we understand them fundamentally as tribal identities. And the other piece sort of going along with this is that I think the nature of Jewish identity is really different for a lot of folks too, right? There are, and it's different in the two great Jewish civilizations of the world, America and Israel today, right? Where if you go into a room of Israeli kids and you ask them what are the similarities, apple, pear, and the last one's another fruit, right? Banana, and then you say Jews and you two blanks and you ask them to fill it in. Israelis are going to say Jews, Arabs, Europeans, and Americans are going to say Jews, Christians, Muslims. And I think that just speaks something really true about how we perceive our identities, where American Jews tend to see it through a more religious lens, which makes sense in an American context, which is so heavy on religion, not to mention that Ashkenazi Jews were able to come over and become like white people of a different faith rather than this racial other that we were in Europe. But I also think that actually the Israeli notion of Jewish identity being national is as much a new construction of Jewish identity as the American notion of Jewish identity being religious. That both of these are changes and reactions to modernity in the same way, really, sorry, I'm like going on, but in the same way that the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community, I think can be understood as just as radical of an innovation as Reform Judaism, in that its conservatism is itself a new radical movement within Judaism in the same way that Reform is a radical reinterpretation. Okay, I've said like way too much and too many different things.
I just want to, I'm not going to respond to all of your points, but you're just making me smile because I'm just remembering a number of years ago in one of the Jewish newspapers in New York, somebody wrote, it was this very odd op-ed, but somebody wrote like this defense of orthodoxy, of like, how do you know that orthodoxy is the legitimate form of Judaism? And I don't know how they knew this to be true, but they said, because if Moses came back today, he would be most comfortable in the Orthodox community, right? Like, so like, solid proof, right? But I remember there was somebody like wrote a response to it and was like, which part of like the Yiddish speaking fur hat wearing part of the community would like Moses get? Like, not like, what about that is what would be familiar, right? And so and like the recognition that actually all of our denominations would be just as foreign in terms of like the societies that we've built. And I'm just saying that because I think that's a really important, I think sometimes when we have these debates, we end up with these debates of like, who's been consistent, you're the one that's changed. And actually the reality is that like America and Israel are both like evolutionary processes, just like our denominations are evolutionary processes, and all of us are the products of modernity. And I think to your point, even those that are sort of like a counter modern traditions are still, they're responsive to modernity in that sense. And so I want to say that just to really emphasize your point.
No, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Go ahead, Cardi.
Yeah, I just want to add two things, three. First of all, Daniel, the person who put in there that my values follow, it was me who put that comment in there.
Yeah,
okay, so,
well done.
No, I just wanted you to know that was me. So, I'm lurking in the background here. The other thing is I want to mention that I come from a city named Winnipeg, which means muddy waters in Cree. And, I never actually thought about this notion of the fact that we took over First Peoples, right, Aboriginal people's lands, despite the fact that we honored those places with the names that we gave them from Cree. But I never really thought about it until I actually came to the United States, right? And so this whole notion of living in a city named St. Louis, right, it really struck me in a way that I hadn't thought about for a very long time. And from the time that I first came to the United States. And living in a place named South Orange didn't really bother me at first, right? But when I came to a place named St. Louis, or I lived in a place called Winnipeg, those things were in my consciousness as well. And I just want to go back to this whole notion of where we center ourselves, because I think that's really where we'll see some important fault lines and good for this conversation, which is where we base ourselves. In other words, in which place do we have the primary? And I know that we're asking ourselves not to necessarily live in that binary or to live in that essentialized place, but I think it's a matter of degree. And there are some folks who've been commenting already who come from different realities, whether they're coming from the former Soviet Union, whether they're coming from Iran, Iraq, Sephardic countries with different kinds of realities than we live with. And I think that's an important part of this consciousness, which I think Daniel was underscoring on some level. Depends where you are living, depends what your frame of reference is, depends what you grew up with. And I think that that's very much part of our consciousness as we have these conversations, and will also lead us in the direction of ultimately identifying where we are on this spectrum, or which we place in Rishon, right? In the first place, in the first category for our identification. And again, I played all those games too, and I was one of those crazy kids who, of course, sat in the middle and didn't want to choose any of the four corners. That's the game we played. Everybody has a different name for it. And I sat in the middle, of course, drove the counselors and the rabbis and the teachers crazy because I didn't want to be pegged. But what's interesting to me as I get a little older, I actually do want to be pegged. I want to be pegged as a Jew, but not a narrow Jew. I want to be a Jew through and through, who utilizes all of the best of our ancient tradition to refract Jewish wisdom and Jewish teaching through my own personal lens, and then bring it into the world in a certain kind of way that can help bring healing and health to the world at large. For me, that's the key part. And that's why I locate myself. And I could easily find a way to switch camps, but I want to really stand firm there, A, because I think it's great for this conversation, and B, because actually it's where I really feel my heart is, that I come from that place first.
Beautiful, beautifully put. I'll add, I think I was one of those kids who also rejected the four corners, but I rejected it differently. I challenged the whole premise of the exercise, and I said this isn't fair, and maybe that's what you were doing by sitting in the middle. But as I've gotten older, I've become more and more comfortable challenging the status quo and the assumptions that I've been told all along the way. And I want to go back to this question before we move on of, do our values come from our identity, or does our identity lead to our values? I'm not convinced, personally, this is just me, that it's possible for us to say that our values come from our identity. And I also think that one of the great challenges of identity politics is when our perceived identity-based values conflict with our instinctive, and I don't know whether they come from nature or nurture or community or peoplehood or faith or whatever, but when what we understand as our core values conflict with the assumed or accrued values of the identity that we thought we were identifying with, how do we deal with that? And I want to push us forward into that by sharing very briefly a story that I think all of you have heard before, but I'll be brief. A number of years ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., lobbying on behalf of a big national Jewish organization that was working to support Israel in our American government, I was in the office of one of our Missouri state senators, who is now a commentator for MSNBC. And I, along with the other representatives of this team who were there to lobby her on behalf of Israel and the agenda that we were fighting for at the time, received a very warm reception from this Democratic senator from the state of Missouri, who said to us, "Yes, I hear you, but I have a question for you." And she turned the question back around to us, who were there to lobby for Israel, by saying, "I understand you're here to lobby for Israel, but I want to ask you why you all," and she was lumping us all in under the umbrella of the lobbying organization that we were there representing, supposedly, why you all support other legislators who are completely antithetical to your perceived Jewish values. And she listed for us the things at that time that were particularly challenging to her: women's rights, the freedom to choose, gun control, things of that sort. And I just want to see if we can. And by the way, before I turn the question back to us, I had no answer for her other than you're right, because I don't think that we as Jews, to your point, Carney, about single issue voters, but also we as Jews cannot assume that one of the perceived values of our Jewish community should guide all of our values. And I want to just see if we can articulate where those conflicts are today for us. We've sort of talked about a number of them along the way over the last 3 weeks. And as we reach the end of our session in a while, I want us to make sure we address where are those points of conflict today for us. Where have we perceived Jewish identity politics challenging our identities and our values? So I'm going to push the three of you to join me in being as specific as we can. What are those issues? And people, please put into the chat as well your comments on this.
There's been an interesting string here of what comes first, right? Values or identity. And I think that's an important part of this conversation as well. Now, what leads you to do what it is that you do in the world at large? And it's part of the initial conversation. I don't know if we want to go off on that tangent yet, but I think it's an important conversation for us, and also very much based on what Rabbi Bennett shared with us in terms of his experience lobbying some unknown senator in an unknown place for an unknown organization.
It was very vague.
Yeah, it was really vague. It was really like I couldn't figure
Trying
out.
to be very vague.
It was really unbelievable. But not to obfuscate the conversation at all. But I do think that this is a key part for us in this conversation, and our orientation to this question does not have to put us in a mousetrap. Because I think that if you said my values, right, come from my tradition and therefore my Judaism comes first, right, is a very legitimate approach. But on the other hand, one could also say, you know, I love this tradition, particularly living in America as we do in the 21st century, when we have a choice to choose which identity we want, to say that I belong to this people because this people reflects the values that I hold near and dear to my heart. I mean, those are actually wonderful opportunities. And again, I want to say, Baruch Hashem, we live in a time and a place where we have the ability to choose that way. We didn't have that reality in some of the other places that we mentioned. Just one other piece here. There was a question here about the difference between, you know, the metaphysical Israel and the physical Israel. And I think that's probably something that we should try to talk about as well in this conversation in terms of values, right? The beliefs in Yerushalayim Shel Mala as opposed to the Yerushalayim Shel Mata, the heavenly Jerusalem versus the earthly Jerusalem. I think that's a key part. And what role did the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, play in this whole conversation that we're having here as well? And I'm just noticing those coming across, a few of them. So maybe they can fuel some of the responses.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
I
Rory,
just want to bring us back that there. I was going to say there really is real social science research on identities now, and lots of it that have come out in the last few years. I want to give a plug for Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, which in some ways is just a review of the recent social science literature on this. But of course, we also know that our pre-existing partisan tribal identities are also going to influence whether we trust things like science and social science itself, or whether it's our sort of gut that we go with, right? And the social science shows that also. So Rory, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no, because I actually wanted to go back to the point that you had made earlier, and I will, Jim, I will get to some specifics, but I think Daniel's point earlier is actually really crucial in this, all of the recognition that in many ways, and I know this is the conversation's also going on through the chat of which is coming first, right? But the idea that I think we have to recognize the fact that our values are certainly coming. I mean, I think a lot of my values do come from my Judaism, but this goes back to what I said at the beginning also. I can't separate out all these different parts of my identity. So my values come from my parents, my values come from my teachers, my values come from the people who mentored me, who influenced me. For me, many of those people were Jewish, and so I can't separate out what were the values that my parents instilled within me, which were their Jewish values and which were their American values and which were their Ashkenazi, or all of their identities, right? All of those are mixed together. So,
Or Rory, can I push you? I just want to push you to tell me why. Why is that such a difficult exercise for us? What, is there not a utility in trying to figure out first sources for things? Don't we often, maybe not, and I'm trying to understand why that is.
yeah,
Because for me, ferreting it out has become a really important part of my process.
So, I mean, I think that's a fair question. Honestly, first of all, I'm not sure that there's actually a usefulness to it. I don't know what difference it would make, but also because any more so than I can say to you, I mean, look, in this conversation, right? So, I mean, we've referenced in various ways, right? There is generational differences between us. There is differences between us in terms of where we come from. I'm the only female identifying person who's in this group. I'm the only Orthodox person in this group. Is what I'm saying now because I'm a New Yorker? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because like I'm me, right? Like I don't carve out these parts of me, and I think that who I am and my perspectives come from the totality of my experiences
But
that include
owning
all
those
of
things,
those things.
but naming those things, I think is
I
very
am.
important for us
I'm.
because it allows us when we're going to have the next part of this conversation potentially about why somebody might become a one issue voter, why
But
somebody.
I want to jump in here. Hold on one sec, Rory. I want to jump in here and just say there are other perspectives on this as well. There's the perspective of some of my best friends are not Jewish, and they share many of the exact same values that I cherish and hold dear, and that I easily and somewhat cavalierly attribute to being Jewish, that I care about these. But the United Church of Christ minister down the road, or the Catholic sister who's joining us today and listening and contributing profoundly, we probably share many, if not most, of the same values. And I'm not sure, it's a little chutzpahdik for us to say those are Jewish values. And you must actually, how many of us have heard somebody say, or ourselves said to somebody who is not Jewish, well, you actually are Jewish and you don't know it because you share these values. And I think that's chutzpah, and I think it gets at the very root of our sense of confidence that our values are exclusively Jewish. And maybe that's the issue we have to clarify. Just because they're Jewish values doesn't mean they're only Jewish values. So, Rory, go
And
ahead.
I'll accept that, and I think that's maybe part of the tension, right? I think, and certainly some of those values I could have as a Jew. I could have learned them in Jewish spaces, but I don't think we have the exclusive rights. But what I want to build up to, and I think this is in many ways Daniel's point, but I want to expand upon, is that what happens is that we then associate with a certain identity. So because of these values, I'm going to join this political party, or I'm going to join this organization, or whatever it is. But, and here's I think the really important part, I think that there are organizations that have a vested interest in trying to then flatten all of these causes, right? Whereas like I can kind of say, like, because of my experiences, I'm here on this issue and I'm here on this issue and all of those things, and that there's groups that are invested. It's not just, Daniel, to your point earlier, it's not just like nonsensical that, you know, because I feel this, I'm also less likely to wear a mask. It's because there's groups that say, if you believe X, then you must believe Y. And that's the part that I think we all need to be really pushing against. And I think this happens also in our Jewish community. I think this happens all across the board. And I think now we're also feeling pulled because, while I think that there's been a lot of organizations that have been doing it on the right, I think we're seeing more and more organizations that see this as a tactic and are adopting it on the left also, right? I might have brought this up in a previous chat. I use this often. I've had a number of people who have reached out to me to say, I need to have coffee with you because I'm really panicking because I can't be a Zionist in progressive spaces. And I say, like, what progressive space were you kicked out of? And they say, none, but people told me I can't be a Zionist in progressive spaces. And I say, well, show up in a progressive space and you're a Zionist, so congratulations. But what happens is that when we repeat this narrative, you can't be a Zionist in progressive spaces, we have told people, and so people then are forced to choose. I'm a Zionist, so I'm either not progressive, or I'm a progressive, so I can't be a Zionist, right? We pit people with those when in fact those two things don't have to correspond directly, right? Or you can be like a, I mean, there are plenty of like Republican voting people who also are very vigilant about wearing their masks, or there's people who are, right, those, you know, we can line up things in any number of ways. And I want to just really, I think in many ways, like, I appreciate Carney and Jim, what you were saying about like being those people who sat in the middle of the room, or being the people who reject the exercise, we need to be rejecting it, because this is where I want to get really specific with your question, Jim. I think that the places where we are being forced, I don't think that they are inherent. I think where organizations are investing money and forcing us to choose are in Zionism, it's in anti-Semitism, now more so it's in racial equity work as well, right? Those are the places where people are suddenly saying, right, if you do this, then you're not fighting anti-Semitism enough. If you are scared of anti-Semitism, you would never support this candidate, you would never show up at this space. That you can't do racial equity work because racial equity work is inherently anti-Semitic. Those are not actually true narratives, but they are narratives that people have invested in that have become dividing points in our Jewish community.
So,
Beautifully put. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Rory, I just want to elevate what you said about Zionism there, because I actually think you did a great job of illustrating the ways that Zionism and being a Zionist can be just entirely a self-identity more than it is anything about what you actually believe about policies, right? That it is a tribal identity that we are describing when we talk about it that way. And I don't mean that to like dismiss it. I'm convinced we are always operating through our tribal identities and competing tribal identities. The other thing I want to raise up that I thought you really illustrated well, Rory, is when you talked about all these layers of your identity, right? Like, are you responding because you're New York, or because you identify as a woman, or because you identify as part of the Orthodox community, or like all these different layers? That's the idea of intersectionality, which is this word that has been so grossly misunderstood and distorted. The truth of it is, I think you probably find this distortion on the left and the right, but particularly on the right, where it's been turned into sort of a nasty, dirty word. The whole idea of intersectionality is simply to recognize that identities always stack up upon each other and create something unique. So that Rory is speaking from her identity, which is a stacking of all these identities, and that's intersectionality. It's the way that all these identities intersect to create a person. It's not some conspiracy against the Jews.
No, and when we're living at a time of increasing attempts for isolating groups by tribal identity or nationalistic identity, and this so-called deny culture, where, as Rory beautifully put it, and you reinforced, Daniel, that we are being told that we have to choose, that we cannot somehow share values with another group, even though it may put us in conflict in some places. Stacking these values, these intersections of values, is the only way out of this morass. And I want us to talk a little bit about it. I don't want to take the time actually to share the article, but I had intended to share an article which we can send out if people are interested afterwards. But one perspective that suggests that when we see ourselves as oppressed, when we see ourselves through the lens, and this overlaps a little bit with what we talked about last week, Carney, when we see ourselves first and foremost through the lens of the powerless as the oppressed, we tend to forget about our comparative ability to be allies to other groups with whom we may not overlap completely. And some of these areas that Rory began to catalog, and we can add to them, the whole BDS movement, the whole Jewish community response to the BDS movement, and the fear of, or Daniel, we've spoken a lot about the breaking the silence group, and the people who speak out, who dare to speak out critically about Israel or Palestine, or here in this country, people who disagree with one another about racial equity, as you said, or racism itself. And the inability of Jews to acknowledge that we are complicit in many of these areas, these conflicts with our values, we back ourselves into corners, and then we end up being surprised when we're told by others, "You're not our ally." And I want to talk a little bit more about our experiences in that arena, our experiences in the arena of trying to speak out about any of these issues. And if anybody's willing to share, happy to put it out to you.
So I want to just, I'm jumping in quickly here, because I think the examples that you gave are such important examples. And I think also are really important examples for ways in which we also make judgment calls about other people based off of a few things that they say. And I give a word of defense to that, because I think that there's there's a protection in that, right? If I'm coming into a room and I don't know who the people are in this room, I don't know where I stand in this room, I'm going to be evaluating the things that they say to try to figure out. So, and sometimes we know there's language people use, incorrectly, but right. So even inherently, right, being a Jew in a Christian space, if I start hearing people talking about Hebrew Bible, I might perk up very differently than people start talking about Old Testament, which is a great example of where people will sometimes just say Old Testament because they don't know that Jews wouldn't consider it an Old Testament. But there's ways in which we evaluate based off of language. But I think even in what you just said, Jim, I mean, I've also had people who've gotten really uncomfortable. People have contacted me because they've been in a space and somebody has said, I believe in Palestinian rights, or I believe in free Palestine, right? And oftentimes in the Jewish community, we hear that as, I want to eliminate Israel from the map. There are people who will make both of those statements. And there's also people who say, I believe that there should be a free Palestinian state alongside a free Israeli state that is Jewish and democratic, and many other opinions that I'm not right. But we jump to conclusions, and I think sometimes that's also a protection, right? Because if you meaning free Palestine means eliminate Israel from the map, then in what ways is my life potentially in danger, or do I feel endangered in relationship to you? So I think there's a way that we naturally as people do that. But that's why, again, I think it's really important for us to name that, to recognize that, because for as much as I don't want people to do that to me, and I find, already, right, people assume because of the work that I do, I must also, right? I've had people who come up to me who say, I already know how you voted. I'm not going to bother asking your opinion, right? And they may guess correctly and they may not guess correctly, because in the reality, we're all layers upon layers and multitudes of identities. And that's what I think. I don't know how we kind of push ourselves. I think that there's ways in which we oversimplify conversations. I don't have time to really get to know someone, or I want to shorten a conversation. So I might call you up and I might say, oh, Jim, I want to refer somebody to you. And I might say a few things that are actually not at all definitive about the person, but I might say, so they grew up going to Reform summer camp, and then they were bar mitzvahed at a conservative synagogue, and right, and those things actually don't tell you anything, but we use them as ways to kind of be like, right, we all become stereotypes. And I think that's a natural thing, but it's, what's the next step, right? How do we get beyond that? How do we recognize the fact, and we know that all about ourselves, right? All of us are the sum total. None of us, I think, want to be defined. But I think we either allow ourselves to get defined by these things, or we then perpetuate it against other people. And so I think I veered a bit off of your question, and so I apologize, but I just think it's really important, because I think as a Jewish community that feels often threatened, we listen for certain trigger words, but the question is, what do we do after we hear that trigger word, right? Like when I'm in a room with somebody and they say, I believe in Palestinian rights, or I believe in a free Palestine, is that the point where I sort of get up and I say, like, I got to get out of here and I got to protect myself? Or is that the point where I say, tell me more about what that means to you? Like, I want to understand, or right, I might have my guard up to say, I have to be careful because it could mean this. I've had that situation where it's gone there, but maybe you're going to take the conversation in a different direction, and I need to hear what comes next from that.
And I just want to go back again to this essentializing, because I really want to drive home this point, at least it's important to me. I think as a Jew, to have that conversation, either to the right or to the left, whether it makes me comfortable or uncomfortable, is not the reality of, for me, that's what actually is the reality for me. In other words, it is what I want to be involved with. I want to be able to bring to bear on the conversation the wisdom of thousands of years of tradition refracted through the lens of my teacher, my experience, and myself, in order to be in those spaces to say, here is an authentically, not the only, authentic Jewish response to this particular conversation. And I think that, at least going back to the essentializing point, that for me, and I want to drive that point home, because there's nothing else that I say here today, that I walk in the world first and foremost as a member of the Jewish people. And because I do, and I think, by the way, my colleagues who are sitting here, I know whether they would put their values first or their tradition or their religious tradition first, right? Judaism first or their ethics first. I think that everything that you do, in every space in which you walk, every space in which you interact, comes from a deep, deep study of, understanding of, appreciation of, and integration of Yiddishkeit, right? Judaism into your being. Every fiber of your being is Jewish. Now, it may have now been infused with other elements as well. But I want to make sure and why that's so important to me is, as I hear this all the time, when somebody dares to say something what is perceived to be anti-Zionist or even a criticism of the state of Israel out loud, immediately they're a self-hating Jew. Immediately, they've abandoned all Jewish values. Immediately, they have no place within the community and have no right to speak on behalf of the Jewish community. It's fascinating. A couple of times already during these conversations, somebody said, it's so nice. We talked about left and leftiest, right? Right. Somebody said, well, how come there's nobody here who represents right, the right wing? It's not true. I don't think any of us could be pegged with a simple brushstroke. There are many colors to all of us, many orientations to all of us, many complex elements to all of us, having to do with all the things that Rory said. But the reason I keep on wanting to essentialize it is I think you do what you do as a Jew.
Beautifully put, everybody. Daniel, go ahead.
This is a little off topic, but I actually just want to hold up a moment of appreciation for Carney, because I think what you said is, it is so true that you walk this walk, that you are committed to a sort of polyphonic Judaism, multivocal Judaism.
That's why I married somebody named Polly. It was very.
There you go. No, but I really believe it. I think the space that you insist on existing, and your position as the senior rabbi of the large conservative shul in town, St. Louis's Jewish discourse is better because of it. So really, I want to take a moment to thank you for that, Carney.
I echo that as well, and I think all of us are here in kind of a sacred responsibility. And as I said last time, and I will come back to this at the end, I hope these conversations that we've been role modeling will continue and will expand to include others, regardless of how they are labeled or seen by those of you out there in the community who have been asking these questions about why don't you have somebody who is further to the right or further to the left or more this or more that. The goal would be for us all to aspire to a multivocal kind of appreciation of the unique differences. I want to go back to something I alluded to earlier that is related directly and pretty exposes a raw nerve, I think, for our community and most communities. And that is those of us who are in the pulpit, or Rory, you who are a communal leader, we are often accused of or labeled as representing one particular side of the Jewish community to the exclusion of another. And I want to talk briefly, if we can, about how it's possible for us to aspire to all these values that we believe are core to us, but also be respectful of those with whom we clearly disagree. And Rory, you touched on this when you're talking about Israel and Palestine, but I think the same is true, and maybe even more so right now in this country. How many people out there, as Jews or as citizens of this country, have said, well, he or she is, and you can fill in the blank, a Trump supporter or a Republican or a Biden supporter or a Democrat, or a mask wearer or a mask refuser, or any, you can fill in the blank.
Marxists are my favorites.
Marxist, right, a Marxist socialist or a protector of the American dream. How many of us have witnessed that, and as rabbis in particular, have experienced the pressure from a community? Don't you dare talk about anything because you will offend me. And I think this is for me, this is the really difficult and somewhat raw nerve of this intersectionality, particularly as a rabbi or a congregational leader or a communal leader. Is it possible for us to kind of tone down the rhetoric and come back to a place where we can say, look, I don't agree with you about your particular policy or strategy or way of getting there, but maybe we can find commonality. I'm just curious if we can talk about this a little bit and see if it's possible, or have we come to a place where these intersectionalities and these identity politics issues are simply divisive and that's the end, and we have to live with that?
So I want to throw in there, because I've gone through this very personally in the last few months in terms of having Shovrei Shtika, the Breakers of Silence, in our shul. So I want to stay very, by the way, we have pulpits, but Rory has a soapbox, so she's very lucky. But I had to say that. But the truth of the matter is that I think that one can have an orientation to all of this that is very Jewish. Again, I want to go back to that fundamental essence for me of the notion of plurality and elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. To live in a reality where there can be these and those are both the words of a living God. And that plurality is what I think I stand for. If there's anything, I stand for that. And to say it in maybe in Voltairean language, right? I will disagree with you to the end, but defend to the death your right to say it.
So when did we as a Jewish community lose that sense of Elu ve'elu? This view and that view are both representative of the voice of the living God. Something happened. Something has happened.
When Holocaust versus Sinai becomes the essence of what we do and motivates us out of fear rather than out of inspiration, then we move into the modality of we can't hear anybody else because we're scared it's going to impact us, it's going to impact our children, it's going to impact the world at large, and it'll be the end of the Jewish people.
Well, I want to say yes to that, but I want to do let's do a little bit of Torah study. What happens before Elu ve'elu and what happens after Elu ve'elu, right? So what we're referencing is, right, it's a piece from the Talmud that describes this battle, really, I mean, these intensive fights that take place between the two schools of thought, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, that not only disagreed about that matters of law, but disagreed about things that would lead into fundamental identity, right? When you start talking about what makes somebody Jewish, right? Who would marry or where you would eat, right? If we start disagreeing about law, then suddenly is your food not kosher? I can't actually eat it, right? But we know from other places it says that they would still eat in each other's home and marry into each other's families. But what happens before we get to the moment of this specific quote is that the Talmud tells us that there was a debate that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had been having for 3 years, right? I think that's first of all really important, right? Because think about it. I mean, on the one hand, that sounds painstaking, but you think about it now, debates last 20 minutes where people are agree to disagree or I'm out, right? They stayed in the discussion, right? For 3 years, they could not come to an agreement with each other, but every day they went home, every night they went home, and the next day they showed up again at the Beit Midrash and they continued it, right? Nobody stormed out and said, I'm starting my own institution, right? I think that's the first thing that we've really lost, that they were deeply invested in staying in it. But I also want to say, and this is kind of a little counter also, right, is that the full quote, right, it's Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, right? These are both the words of living God, but the rule is according to the rule of Beit Hillel, right? Beit Shammai is also right.
Only for a period of time, though. Only for a finite period of time. Olam hazeh, but not olam haba.
As finite as that is, fine.
So,
in this room, but regardless, I think there also is a point where that's also right, that somehow by saying Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, it somehow has come to mean you must actively include me in every single place, as opposed to there's a point where, and all of us deal with boards, there's a point where there could be people who disagree, who could be the dissenting vote on the board, and at some point you take a vote, and whatever the vote is, everyone has to then move forward with it, right? So there's a point where we could be disagreeing, should we redo the sanctuary or not redo the sanctuary, should we, whatever it is, right? And there's a point at which also you can't kind of say we're gonna redo part of it and leave part of it before. There's a point at which you also move forward, and I think we've actually lost both of those things. I think we've lost the ability to stay in the debate and say, I don't agree with you, but I will still have coffee with you next week. The number of people who I've also had who have cut me off because they've said I've given up, even as I continue to say I'm happy to talk about it, but I can't do what you want me to do. We've lost, but we've also, I think, lost because there's those people who want to use Elu ve'elu to hijack conversations to say my point is valid, and your point could be 100% valid, but for a myriad of reasons as a community, this has been the decision that we are going to move forward with, and your point is still incredibly valid, and we still want you included, and you still get the same vote on the next occasion, but we are going to have to move forward with a decision because you can't stay in limbo forever.
And those communal members who are willing to stay in that, as opposed to saying, if you don't agree with me, I'm picking up and I'm leaving, either moving elsewhere to a subset of the community that all agree with me so that we can be monolithic, or worse, the frightening outcome, even worse than that, because, God bless, if somebody chooses one synagogue or organization over another, we're not as rich if we become more polarized, but at least they're still in the community. But the worst is when people say, I'm leaving completely, I'm gonna walk away. And this is the Zionism challenge, this is the challenge of American politics today, And it's the challenge of the BDS movement to some degree as a subset of the Zionism challenge that has left us with such polarization that we've forgotten it. And Carney, I'm so grateful to you for lifting that text up, and Rory for explicating it. It's an important lesson for us to learn. I think, Carney, you were going to jump in?
I was just going to add one thing about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Just please remember that there were very few arguments between Hillel and Shammai. There were a myriad of arguments between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And for me, that's very instructive, right? Very instructive that we are not the masters. We don't have the ultimate, even if Hillel and Shammai themselves were masters and really had the ultimate answers, we have a certain humility that says we are not that, we're not the essential place, right? We are that step removed from the essential knowing, the absolute knowing. And so that humility is a very important part of this conversation as well. And therefore, even when we have to say, as Rory has suggested, and I think it's very wise, right? There are moments, all of us in our institutions, that say, we're going to go in this direction, even though there might be a small vocal, even, by the way, at least in our shul, I know it works in other shuls, every vote is unanimous after the fact. Right, right. It's unanimous, right? Except when I was sick, Harvey Greenstein, God bless him, maybe he's on here. He said the board got together and voted 25-24 that you should have a refuah shalema. But it's a great line. But I just want to say that I think there's something very different about being humble enough to know that I'm not Hillel and not Shammai. At best, I'm part of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, and therefore I have to make even more room because I don't have ultimate answers.
So can I push us? Oh, Daniel, please go ahead.
I want to take a little more subversive of a read on this Elu ve'elu story, actually, because the other pieces I don't think we've contextualized is it's known to the reader in advance, generally, that the halakha, the Jewish law, the way we actually are supposed to live in the world, not is there truth out there in these positions, but the way we're supposed to live in the world, halakha, is with Hillel. So the question that's actually asked in this text is, if both are true, Elu ve'elu, then why is it that we follow Hillel? And there is an answer at the end. And the answer is because Hillel studied the teachings of Shammai and themselves, the house of Hillel, whereas Shammai only studied their own teachings. And I sometimes think that this is used as a sort of, I think the cheap version of this text is to say, and that's why you should watch CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, right? They all Elu ve'elu. But I actually don't think that's the real message of the text. I think the real message of the text is this: the people who should be deciding our laws should be pluralists. I think it's very clear here that it is the pluralists.
Or at least study the positions that they don't agree with and know them well.
Yeah, that it is those folks who we should be following. That the people who don't are people we should not follow, even if they have truth. Even if it's worth knowing them and studying them, we should not live like they do. And I think this is again, I think this is a much more subversive read of this text, but I also think it's right there in the text.
Well, I share that with you, and I think it's a great teaching for us. I'm watching the clock, and I want to leave time for us to address some of the questions that are coming in. I also would like to suggest that we think about the implications of this conversation today for us as a Jewish community. To be more specific, over the next 70 days in this country, what could we do better to honor the commitments we've discussed in very theoretical terms today? What could we do differently? And how could we individually, but also as a Jewish community, be more true to this story, this narrative about how to honor these values of our tradition? Also, before we get into that, Rabbi Rose, would you like to respond to the question about the relevance of Holocaust museums that was posted? I think it was a reaction to your comment about Auschwitz versus Sinai.
I absolutely think that there's a place in Jewish communities for Holocaust museums. There's a place. Again, there must be Holocaust, so there must be Sinai. That we have to keep those consciousnesses in dynamic tension with one another. And so there is a place, and in particular, I'm very moved by what I'm understanding. I don't have inside information here. Michael Litwack, who asked the question, surely has more information, and others on this call. But I think that there is a place for it, and I understand also that we're expanding the consciousness of the Holocaust Museum to not only be about the Shoah as it impacts the Jewish community, but how it impacts the world, and what are the lessons, eternal lessons, that we can learn from the Shoah for all of humanity. And therefore, I'm very happy to see that this is transpiring. I would not want for the entire prime focus of the Jewish community, which it's not going to be, but if it ever became Shoah, then I would be worried. And that's why I think David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, our teacher, shared the article that he shared, because that was his consciousness, his understanding, his awareness, both having been in North America and also being in Israel. So I appreciate the opportunity to answer the question. I hope that that's helpful.
No, thank you. Beautifully put. So how can we, beginning to wrap up here and leave time for any other questions, I'm going to encourage all of you who are listening to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A on Zoom so that we can address what you have left to respond to. But how can we turn these ideals into action? Particularly, I'm really thinking about the next 70 days as we approach the nation's election. What could we do differently? How could we do it better? And what could we do that would embrace this commitment to not falling into the black hole, this abyss of Jewish identity politics to our own detriment? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I would start with simply with this, that I do not believe it to be a Jewish value that every conversation becomes vitriolic attack on somebody that you disagree with, screaming from the podium as you're delivering a speech and telling blatant untruths about others who care about the destiny not only of America, but the destiny of the world, would be, I would call, blatantly anti-Jewish. And I think that we as rabbis have a responsibility and obligation, at least I'll take it upon myself, not to foist obligations on anybody else, but to speak out against that kind of vitriol and that kind of castigation of others. And if we don't do that, then we are not, I don't think we own the title or have the right to own the title of being Rabbanim or being Maharats, of being folks who are leaders and teaching our tradition honestly, with integrity, and I will be this bold as to say, as the creator of the universe wanted Torah to be taught.
Beautiful.
I want to just build off of that because I think that was so beautifully said. And I want to just say, I think we need to reject every premise. That's what I want to see us doing. Reject the premise of the questions. That's kind of my theme for the day, I think, in this conversation, but I think it's so important. And I think goes back exactly to what you're saying, Carney. Just because somebody said something doesn't mean that, or right, just because it comes from a more left-leaning news source doesn't mean it's inherently Marxist, and just because it's coming from a more right-wing news source doesn't mean it's inherently racist, right? Or just because this person said it, like, what does it look like to actually go through the world? And I appreciate that you said 70 days, Jim, but I want to also push back and say, we've got 26 days until Rosh Hashanah, and until Yom Kippur, right?
Beautiful.
Like this is the time, like we're all, hopefully, I mean, we're not really gathering, but it's the time for self-reflection. And it's often easy. It's easy to just read something and then like it on Facebook or share it. But what we're not doing is we need to really think about what is the premise of the discussion. So when somebody says, are you, do you support fighting anti-Semitism or do you support fighting racism? I reject that question, right? Those are not a binary, right? Like too often we get caught with people giving us binaries that need to be rejected, and we need to reject also our assumptions. And frankly, just because I might have debated with somebody last week and disagreed with them on something doesn't mean that what they're bringing to me next week is going to be something we're going to disagree about, or doesn't mean that I'll disagree with them either. And so I want to really push us as much as possible to just reject the assumptions.
Beautiful. Yeah. Anybody else? As David Rosenstock just posted in the chat, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, for example, in this upcoming election, which impacts all of us and our Jewish community as well as our nation as a whole, regardless of the outcome of the election, there will be many people who will be disappointed by the results, and true leadership, which seems to be sorely lacking, will be a leadership that helps alleviate that sense of loss that one side or the other will feel, and helps to build that sense of respect, that elu ve'elu, to use that text again. And I think that, frankly, I'll sort of admit this as a congregational leader. That's our responsibility, and as a Jewish communal leader, that's our responsibility to speak about the outcome of this election, regardless of the outcome, regardless of what we may personally believe is our own desire or necessity for the outcome of the election, to find a way to build towards collaborative, unified, respectful, honest, open, moving forward. That is the great challenge here. I don't know if anybody else wants to add their thoughts on this.
I really want to make sure that we're pastors, because I think we're going to need to provide tremendous pastoral counseling to people post this election. And there's going to be, v'heshiv lev avot al banim v'lev banim al avotam. There are families that are so profoundly divided. Maybe I see the affirmative nods, which means that you're experiencing this as well, even within families who are not speaking with one another at a time of pandemic when we can't come close to one another. The people that you rely on most are the people within your own circle of family, and these people are not talking to each other. I mean, they're really fissures in families. So imagine what fissures will be like in congregations, in communities at large. And so I think our biggest responsibility is to say, when the dust settles and we have a president, and you can add new president or same president, put it in there, whatever it is that you want, right? But when the dust settles, that's our job to bring people back together again. And if we don't, we won't be much of a community. And I just want to remind myself, at least, that the whole conversation here that the Hartman Institute, God bless them, has enabled us to have, really, or trained us to have, is the future of the Jewish people. Not in Israel, not in America, but the future of the Jewish people. And if, again, we don't have to be the same, but we have to feel some sense, at least I hope we will feel some sense of obligation, responsibility, fealty, fidelity, whatever word you want to use, to be together. And if we have to have that in microcosms in families, and then in slightly larger microcosms in our congregations and in our community at large, and then we can spread that throughout. But I think that at least my job is going to be holding the hands of people post this election who are really unhappy.
Is it fair to say then, Rabbi, that the most important values right now may be, at this time in history, may be the values of listening and honesty and reflection and humility, much more so than the policies and the decisions and the things that we get caught up in?
I would say chesed, rachamim,
chesed,
because I actually think those are all beautiful things, but I want to give it Jewish language. It's chesed and rachmanut and rachamim. Those are things that I think are going to be the most important part of our community if we're going to stay together. If not, we learned at Hartman the notion of Judaisms, right? The tribes of Israel kind of notion, right? At least that was when I'm the old man in the group, at least when it comes to Hartman. That was a conversation we were having way right at the beginning of this whole business with Hartman. And so the Judaism still feel connected to one another. The tribes of Israel, as they aligned themselves in the desert and as they aligned themselves when they made their way into the land, aligned themselves. And they aligned themselves in certain kinds of ways for pluses and minuses and the arguments, and it's all the other, but they aligned themselves. So can we align ourselves once again and find more that connects us than divides us?
Beautiful.
So I'm struck that we're in a time period right now where we're reading these Haftarot of consolation, of comfort, right? Where I think one of the messages here from a Jewish perspective is that there are times and there are moments when comfort and consolation are what we need and where we have to be. But I also want to hold on to the fact that those Haftarot end when we get to the new year and we start a whole new process. And comfort is important, and coming together is incredibly important in the ways that, in a spiritual sense, the myths that hold us together as a Jewish people appear to be fracturing, and the myths that hold us together as an American country spiritually appear to be fracturing. It can be easy to fall into, I think, a place of valuing comfort and coming together. But I also want to suggest that, like the idea that we should be less political, being less political is itself an incredibly political statement. It's just one that upholds the status quo. And I am concerned that a values proposition that holds comfort and consolation alone at the top as the pinnacle, it becomes too easily a values proposition that supports the status quo, that supports those people who are frankly already comfortable, rather than those people who are on the margins, who need to be brought in, who are in danger.
Okay,
And I want to hold
Tov
on to Elu,
Darashta.
but Elu, these and these. But
Tov Darashta, I'm with you. I just want to remind ourselves of the structure, right? There's 3 haftarot defuranuta, of chastisement, and there are 7 haftarot of nechemta, of consolation, right?
And
And I
then
gotta
we
say, yeah,
and then we start again, and we've got
right.
work to do. That's the
Absolutely.
issue.
Right. And again, I think you're right. It's cyclical, maybe like a helix, kind of going hopefully higher or deeper as we go there. But I think that right after the chasm, right, this breaking the brokenness of this election, our job will probably be not 7 weeks of comfort. We're going to need to comfort a lot of people for a long period of time. And in fact, living at a time of brokenness in and around the political realities, brokenness in and around the racial issues, brokenness in and around the issues of forget racial justice, of inequities of all sorts, right? There's so much that pandemic, all of this is hitting us at one moment in time. I think, for me at least, the most important part of all of this is going to be being a presence that, without anxious posture, without defensiveness, hearing, listening, as you said so beautifully, Rabbi Bennett, and then using that place of chesed and rachamim to be there and present to people, to absorb people back into the womb of the incubation of a Jewish community that will be present to it and protect it, because otherwise it is so fragile. We are on the precipice, I think, of a division that our generation will look back and say, what the heck did we do?
And Elu, Rory, go.
Yeah, sorry, Jim. I know you're trying to.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I want to go back to something that I said on a previous week, and I've seen it come up a few times today, but I think it just bears repeating because I wonder, I'm glad for all the people who have expressed appreciation for this conversation, but I feel like we've done a bit of a disservice in certain ways, because there's people who are looking at us and they're saying, well, sure, it's really easy for them to have that conversation because they all agree with each other, but what about the rest of us? Or what about the spaces where we can't agree? And I want to really say, we don't all agree with each other. And I want to just make sure, because I want to pull back the curtain and say very intentionally what we are doing here is showing what it is. I will not tell you that I agree with everybody else on this panel. What I will tell you is that I have the utmost respect for every single one of them, and a deep love and appreciation for every one of them. And that has come from getting to know them, from seeing them work in their communities, and from knowing, and I think this is a lot of Carney, the underpinning of what you've been lifting up, that what has been the driving force for, I'm going to speak for the three of you, but what I have witnessed for the three of you, the driving force of really a deep love for the Jewish people and a deep commitment to what it is to be part of a growing and a healing and a visionary process of the Jewish people, even as I have not always agreed on where you might end up or where your communities might end up. And that what you're hearing in this and the exchange that you're having, it's not that it's not a debate because we're not jumping in, but it's what it is it's us deeply listening to each other and saying that there's times where I say something and somebody else responds, and it might be different than what I would have liked them to say or want them to say. And I'm not going to say no because I'm going to hear it. I'm going to hear it because it really comes out of a deep place of respect and love. And that's, I think, kind of what we lost. And so I don't want anyone to think this is easy because they've already done it, or this is easy because they already really like each other. I really like them because I've gotten to know them and because I respect them. But at no point in this conversation have I agreed with everything. And in fact, sometimes me nodding along is me changing my mind because somebody has said something in a new way that I haven't thought about. So I really need you all to know that what part of the reason we're doing this wasn't just to say, we want you all to listen to us and this would be really fun, but because we wanted to also show that 4 people can get on this. And certainly there's other people we can add in, and we'll talk about that more. Are there people that might kind of trigger us in a very different way? And we'll think about what we can do with it. But I don't want you in any way to think that this was just this was fun for us, but it was fun for us because we built a relationship that predated this, not fun for us because we're all just repeating each other and all just agreeing with each other.
Thank you, Rory. Beautifully said. As we get, I'm going to use your statement as kind of the beginning of our wrap up because our time is rapidly drawing near. And I'd like to come back to you at the end, Rory, for a final statement. But Daniel and Carney, if you want to each make a brief kind of summary statement as well.
I,
Either way.
yeah, I'm thinking about the other origins actually for a moment. Rory, I so appreciated what you just said and totally agree with it. I think we are interested in understanding each other more than we are interested in convincing each other. To me, that is like the fundamental distinction of this conversation. And so people, right, we learn to interpret that as we all agree, I think, but that's not what's happening. We just are interested in understanding rather than convincing. But I actually have been thinking about the other origin, right? One of the origins of this happening is that we've been talking about wanting to do a set of Israel conversations for a while in various configurations, and various ones of us, particularly those four of us who are the Hartman Fellows and some other, truthfully, other Hartman connected rabbis in town. But the other origin to this, I think, is that all four of us have experienced a bullying that happens in every Jewish American community that I know of around boundary setting of what is acceptable to say or not say when it comes to particularly Israel. And it is personal, and it is bullying, and it is vitriolic. And I have never experienced the sort of online and truthfully in-person harassment that I have experienced as a rabbi in St. Louis anywhere else that I have ever been. At least from within the Jewish community. There's, white supremacist Nazi trolls everywhere. Rory and I were just laughing about that. Like, I sent her one and she sent something to Scott Biondo. But like, if we sent every white supremacist troll that we got to Scott Biondo, it'd be his whole email.
I didn't realize that was our job to send all that stuff to Scott Biondo.
Yeah.
I'm gonna.
But right, like, as bad as it is from that community, I think the other origin here is that it exists here too, and we experience it as individuals. And I think the leadership across the board in the Jewish community experiences it. I think the Jewish Light's opinion page is a reflection of the distortion of this. I think you can see it all across our Jewish spectrum, and I think Jewish leadership up and down. Sort of every organization has experienced this bullying around this issue, and I want to hold on to that as something that I believe at least the rabbinic leadership in St. Louis is pretty committed to pushing back on.
Thank you. Carney, a last statement?
I would just say that for some rabbis, being in the rabbinate can be lonely. And I want to make sure that I honor the fact that if you were feeling lonely as a colleague, I want to hope that this helped us a little bit feel closer to one another. And I've got to say that I do feel closer to this group of rabbis based on these conversations and hearing what's in your minds and in your hearts. And I'll just finish with this. I actually came into this to learn. Yeah, I was asked to share, right? But I actually learned much more from all of you than I shared. And so I really am appreciative of that. And I have taken copious notes, and I will steal many of your beautiful lines that you shared here, hopefully B'Shem Omro with attribution. But they're really remarkable gems, and I really appreciate it. And I hope that we'll continue to do this amongst ourselves and for our Jewish community, because we will be enriched by these kinds of very fruitful conversations. So thank you all, and toda rabah.
And I'll echo the same sentiments. I, like Daniel, I came into this at least initially because I felt there was an opportunity and a need for us to speak more candidly about issues of Israel and Zionism and Palestine rights, etc. But I think this has gone far beyond our wildest expectations. And I hope, and I genuinely hope, that we have not simply done a nice 4-week webinar series, but that not only have we forged these beautiful and growing relationships between the four of us and many of you who've been listening, but also that we will, after the High Holy Days, move into our rearview mirrors this year, that we will find more opportunities to invite more of the community to join us in this kind of behavior and modeling, and that we can begin to expand the dialogue and include many more voices and build even more relationships, because that ultimately is, of course, the purpose. So Thank you, Ann. Rory, you want to share a final comment on behalf of JCRC? Oh, Rabbi, please.
Just wanted to add one piece. We did in our last few sessions mention folks in our community who were lost, who passed away, who died. And I wanted just to make mention that our Chazan, Sher Nathanson, lost her brother Ken at a very young age. So I want to maybe dedicate this amazing moment in time when we're here together to the memory of Ken Goldman and send nechama, comfort and consolation to a colleague who works in the vineyard of the Lord on a regular basis, and particularly before Shana and Yom Kippur, to be in Avelut is really a challenging moment for her. So we're sending love in her direction. And with that, I hand it over to the Maharat.
We started by invoking some history in our community and our colleagues, and I can think of no more appropriate way than to end with that. And I'm so deeply grateful. I'm deeply grateful for these relationships. I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity. But most of all, I'm deeply grateful to this community that has welcomed us all in on your Tuesday afternoons, that has given us this space, that has lifted up this space, that has really supported it. And I think also that you all have become part of this model for what these conversations could be, because the deep truth in all of this is that all of us are subject to boards. We all, if we were saying things that that the community was deeply rejecting, we could be facing really deep problems. And so what it is to be part of a community that has embraced this conversation, even as you have not always agreed with all of our points, I think has been the greatest gift for me. So on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you and thank you for continuing this conversation with us in the myriad of spaces that this will happen, whether it's around your dinner table amongst friends, or once we're able to gather again as a community. As we say, B'mhera b'yameinu, may it be soon, and may it be in our days, hopefully very soon. And I hope everyone continues to stay healthy and stay well. And we will.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there's a way that you could just, if you were interested in continuing or having us do another session just for questions and answers, since we tried mightily to get to the questions and answers and did not, maybe, I don't know, the JCRC has a wonderful website. You can go there and you could find the Mahararis.
You could. All of you, yeah, and all of you should have received my email address when you registered, so you can feel free, and some of you have gotten emails from me, so feel free to respond to that. The four of us will be talking, we'll be discussing next steps, but we do welcome all of your feedback. I haven't discussed, I don't know if we'll do like a formal survey, but you know, feel free to send your thoughts, and you'll be hearing from us, I can guarantee that.
Well, I think that we just want to say thank you to all of you. Wish you all an early Shana Tova, a healthy journey through the month of Elul. And we look forward to seeing you, interacting with you, virtually and otherwise, in the coming weeks and months and beyond. So thank you all.